Is apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 a reference to apostasy or to the rapture? Is it true that the word apostasia in this passage can't mean apostasy because there isn't going to be a distinct apostasy in the last days? Stay tuned for an insightful handling of this question. Hi there, I'm Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Soothkeep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. Now, in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 we read, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." Now, the word translated falling away here in the King James Version is apostasia. And there is a rapidly growing opinion that apostasia in this passage is a reference to the rapture and not to apostasy. So which is it? Is this passage presenting the rapture or the apostasy as the event that marks the beginning of the day of the Lord? Now, it would be cool if this actually were a rapture reference, but we must doggedly stick to the trail of facts. We must doggedly stick to the path of rejecting bad arguments, no matter where these practices lead us. For myself, I find the case for the rapture understanding to be a string of weak arguments and misleading arguments. In the argument that we're addressing today, the claim that there is no distinct apostasy in the last days is a straw man argument that must be rejected. Let's start by examining the claim that there will be no distinct apostasy in the last days. The argument starts with the observation that the word apostasia here appears with the definite article. In other words, the text does not say an apostasia, but the apostasia. Well, this observation is legit. The argument continues with presenting us the choice between the, with the reading except the apostasy come first, and the reading except the rapture come first. And so far, so good. I have no complaints up to this point. But then the argument raises its main challenge to the apostasy understanding. It claims that there have always been apostasies in the church age, so how can there be a distinct apostasy in the last days? How are we going to distinguish the apostasy from all of the apostasies that preceded it? For many folks, this torpedoes the apostasy understanding of the passage and tips the scale in favor of the rapture understanding. But this claim that there will be no distinct apostasy in the last days is completely bankrupt. Well, let's turn to the form and essence of the argument, because we're going to see that they are invalid. First of all, the form of the argument itself is invalid. It leads the witness. It frames the question in such a way that it implies that it is an established fact that there will be no exceptional manifestation of apostasy in the last days. And there's not going to be any apostasy that's going to stand out from all the string of apostasies in the church age that preceded it. But this, folks, is not a proven fact. Practices like leading the witness and begging the question should be rejected on principle, across the board, without exception. Secondly, if we boil the argument down to its essence, we get the astounding claim that patterns in history forbid preeminent examples at the end of the age. This seems absurd to even consider it. Let's apply this argument to another phenomena in the last days, the Antichrist. Now, we know there have always been antichrists throughout the church age. John himself writes, in his day, many antichrists have come. 1 John 2:18. Does this prove that there won't be an antichrist in the last days known as the Antichrist? How will we be able to distinguish the Antichrist from all the antichrists that preceded him? Now, we can try out this theory on other expressions too. Is it legit to say that there can't be a man in the last days known as the man of sin because there has always been men of sin? How can we distinguish the man of sin from all the men of sin that preceded him? Well, folks, there is going to be a distinct apostasy in the last days. What's interesting about this is prior to the controversy over the rapture interpretation of Apostasia, it was the general consensus of virtually everyone who took prophecy literally that the last days would be characterized by apostasy that vastly transcends all the preceding apostasies in church history. And they held this ground for two main reasons. One, the foundation of the final apostasy is going to be unique. And two, the final apostasy itself is going to be unique. So let's look at the unique foundation of the final apostasy. First of all, let's examine perversion. There has always been moral perversion throughout church history, throughout the entire church age. But it was always a small percentage, and it was always in the closet. In the last days, this perversion is going to sweep the entire globe and fill it with perversion like Sodom and Gomorrah were filled with perversion. We already see this process in a vastly advanced state, a terrifyingly advanced state. And this was something that was not seen prior to this in church history. Up until the 60s, we hardly saw any inkling of this. And now it's rampant, and it's going to explode in the last days proper. This is unique. This is unique apostasy. Well, how about the question of atheism? There has always been some atheism in the church and in the church age. In the last days, however, atheism is going to characterize the entire world. It's going to saturate the entire world. This is something that was not seen in the church age. This will be unique. This will be unique apostasy. Now, when we come to the church, here again, we can say, well, yes, there's always been apostasy in the church. But in the last days, all the groups that are separated from the apostasy are going to be flooding back into the apostate mother church. They're going to go back to Rome. This is something that was not seen in church history, but it's going to be seen in the last days. We already see the early inklings of this. And soon this process of streaming back to Rome is going to explode and accelerate. And this is unique. This is not something that we see over and over again in church history. This is unique. This is last days unique. Now let's examine the uniqueness of the final apostasy itself. We have to understand that the apostasy is associated with the man of sin, the Antichrist. It's the apostasy because it is associated with the man of sin, the Antichrist. Now, we see this connection when we examine the passages which address the Antichrist and his apostasy. For instance, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, through the whole stretch on the Antichrist. And we also see that this is indicated by the grammar right here in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. The word first applies to both the apostasy and the man of sin, and to the revelation of the man of sin. It's not limited to apostasy alone. These two things come together. They're wicked twins joined at the hip. Let me give you an illustration of how the grammar here works in Greek. It works exactly the same way it does in English. Let's say a dad says to his boys, "We will go camping this weekend, boys." if you first cut the grass and the garage gets cleaned. Now, there's no order here that's necessitated by the grammar between cutting the grass and cleaning the garage. The dad doesn't really care whether they clean the garage first or cut the grass first, as long as both jobs get done. So the word first isn't in the relationship between the two jobs. The word first is in relationship between those two jobs and going camping. They have to get their jobs done first, and then they can go camping. So let's apply this to the passage at hand. And what do we see? We see that the day of the Lord is not going to come unless two things happen first, and they happen together: the apostasy and the man of sin. So the distinct apostasy at the end of the age can only happen when the distinct Antichrist appears on the world stage at the end of the age. Now, the start of his apostasy is going to happen when the Antichrist forces a covenant upon the people and nation of Israel. We see this in Daniel 9:27. And this covenant is a covenant with hell. We see this in Isaiah 28:15, where we read, "We have made a covenant with death and an agreement with Sheol," or an agreement with hell. Sheol is just the Old Testament word for Hades or hell. Now, this implies that Israel is making a conscious covenant, a conscious agreement with the devil, with hell. She's trying to avoid being overrun by evil that threatens her, but her effort to avoid evil is going to backfire, and she is going to end up in the cauldron of the tribulation. Now, Israel's conscious agreement with hell is unique in the annals of the church age. There's nothing like it anywhere. Now, we can point to things like Hitler, and we can say, well, yeah, in Hitler's inner circle, they were all definitely in agreement with some very powerful fallen spirits or fallen angels. But the German people as a whole were not down that track. The German people as a whole were just misguided by over-the-top patriotism. Now, this apostasy is going to come to a head when the Antichrist sits in the temple, bans everything that is called God or that is reverenced, and declares himself God and demands that the whole world worship him on pain of death. We see this in 2 Thessalonians 2:4. This is going to be the pinnacle of apostasy in the history of the world since the beginning of the church age. There's nothing even close to this in the history of the world since the church age. Now, you can point to the Catholics in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the Inquisition ages who are bowing to the Pope as the vicar of Christ. But that's child's play compared to what's going on in the last days, when the whole world worships the Antichrist, worships a human being, not as the representative of Christ, but as God himself, as God manifest as a human being. Now, the church fathers understood very clearly this close relationship between the Antichrist and the apostasy. Some of them even called the Antichrist the apostasy because he brings man's rejection of God to its ultimate height and climax. For instance, Irenaeus says in Heresies 5.28.2, he concentrates in his own person the apostasy. And Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, section 110, says, well, he just calls him the man of apostasy. Eusebius, in his fragments on Luke, in a section on chapter 17, verse 26, calls the tribulation the season of apostasy. And later on, he says of this time, all the ungodly having been molded into atheists by the Antichrist, the whole world being dominated by the apostasy. Origen, in his Scholia on Revelations, in Scholion 38, says, he, the Antichrist, sums up all the apostasy in his own person. And Theodore, in his Compendium of the Fables of the Heretics, chapter 5, verse 23 sums up Paul's handling in 2 Thessalonians 2 with the following words. He calls the coming of the Antichrist apostasy itself. And the same brother, Theodore, in his commentary on the letters of St. Paul, 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says, by apostasy he referred to the Antichrist in person, making a title out of the event. So he was applying the phrase, the apostasy, to the Antichrist himself. In conclusion, I trust that you can now see, or at least see more clearly, that there will be a distinct, a unique apostasy at the end of the age that merits the label, the apostasy. It will be called the apostasy because it is associated with the Antichrist, who leads the world into apostasy that is far broader, far deeper, and far blacker than any apostasy in church history. There is nothing that compares to it. Eyes wide open, brain engaged, heart on fire. We'll see you next time.